Welcome back to yet another episode of the Unveil podcast, where today it is my pleasure to speak with Jeanne Denney. Jeanne is the founder of the School of Unusual Life Learning, which is an acronym SoULL, and you may need to read the show notes to work out what that spells. But this is an institute for somatic education. She's also a practicing somatic psychotherapist, a death educator, and the author of The Effects of Compassionate Presence on the Dying. Jeanne has worked in many venues to help people fearlessly embrace a life which includes aging, dying, and nature. She has spent decades at bedsides with the elderly and with the growing bodies of children in study and research, and has contributed pioneering ideas to somatic psychology, death, and grief work. She has also helped create and facilitate the Art of Dying projects in New York City. Her unique insights on energy and the body through aging, illness, and dying have been derived from this wide lens of human experience and a deep understanding of our mortal journey. And, unsurprisingly, it is that mortal journey that we discuss in depth today. We go into how certain modern psychotherapeutic, somatic techniques, and even healing coaching disciplines tend to eliminate death from the conversation, focusing solely on life preservation as the mandate. You will know that I am a life rejuvenating, health optimizing professional, and that is an interesting topic for me to get into when I realized, as you will hear me do live on this podcast and during this interview, that there is no life, and certainly no life optimization, without the inclusion of death. Without further ado, I hope that you enjoy this interview with Jeanne Denney. It is so great to be speaking to you. We've spent about 5 minutes talking, and I'm already massively intrigued and was like, no, stop, because I want to press record. So welcome to the Unveil podcast. I'm delighted to have you here. And as I always do, I'm just going to allow our listeners to get a window into who you are and what you do by asking my favorite opening question, which is, how do you serve?
Oh, my goodness. Well, what takes up most of my time right now is running a little school called the School of Unusual Life Learning.
Mm-hmm.
And that has been my focus for the last 5 to 10 years, developing ideas first from a very theoretical perspective, and now working it all the way down into a training program for professionals. So lots of steps there. And of course, I'm also a body-centered psychotherapist and transpersonalist and a mother and grandmother and friend to people. So those were my main services in the world.
I love it. How did we get here? So what led you into the body-centered psychotherapy realms? What was the spark of interest for you?
Oh, wow. Spark of interest. I think it was more of a compulsion, you know.
Right.
I actually had about 20 years working as a bridge designer. I designed movable bridges, the kind that open and close, and I had 4 children, and I was doing human development pretty intensively there as a mother for quite a long
Mm-hmm.
time, and being an engineer. And I was going along in life, not quite feeling like I was in the right place. And then, actually, I had 2 children, and I had a twin pregnancy. That after having 2 children, that put me at 4, which really blew me open in every way,
Mm.
physically, psychologically. And at that point, I started therapy and was blessed enough to have a therapist that started me on the trail of learning about spirituality and the body. So that was
Mm.
probably in about 1995.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And the rest is history, as they say. It just takes
Oh,
one.
right. Yeah, yeah. I think there's another point that I would put on the map of how I got here, and that is that my mother died in
Mm.
2002 very suddenly. And
Mm.
between those two things, the birth of my children, that I, was a surprising, thing, and expansive thing, and the death of my mother opened up another door, which is the door of death and dying. And then that opened another whole large set of questions.
Okay, and we're going to dig into all of this today because
Mhm.
the death and dying piece is something that, as we were saying before we press record, is not really there in some of this work. So I really want to dig into those. But can we just help our listeners a little bit? Those who are familiar may understand this, but what is the body-centered psychotherapy kind of lens? How do you describe it?
Well, how do I describe it? I would say the unity of our consciousness, our
Mm.
bodies, and our spirituality is most of what body centered work is about.
Hmm.
Uh, I don't really know how people work without that lens, the lens that sees consciousness, human development, spirituality, and life and purpose all together.
Hmm.
So I was blessed enough to start with people that had that lens, and
Yeah.
so always just been the way for me.
Mm.
Uh, but yeah, I think that's how I would say it.
Mm. It's interesting you say that. You don't know very much about what I do, but I run the clinical programs at a place called Kuya, which originally set out to be a mental health kind of place, but realistically is whole human care. And I was having a conversation with our CEO the other night, and we were like, how do people do mental health without like looking at the rest of the picture? Like, how is it even possible? So I love when I speak to people who are, the alternative doesn't even really exist as a potential, because that speaks to my soul and my language. So
Yeah,
yes.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Um, the School of Unusual Learning. What makes it unusual, and what are we teaching at the School of Unusual Learning?
It's actually the School of Unusual Life Learning,
Life
which got
learning.
two L's, which makes it a little different. It's
Hmm.
even more unusual. What makes it unusual is that we're incorporating ideas of aging and dying into vitality.
Hmm.
Up to now, at least certainly in my neo-Reichian body-centered psychotherapy training, we studied human development from birth to about, I don't know, maybe 8 years old. And that was all we studied. And everything else was pretty much focused on early development. And that's
Yeah.
what Freud and his earlier followers did. I mean, they were
Hmm.
looking at early development. Very important that they did that work. Um, there was nothing much interesting to happen other than 25 years old and becoming fully sexual, and that was supposed to be the panacea for everything, is have orgasm, right? And then you'll be whole, or at least not neurotic. Um, that was, a product of Victoriana, I think, in Europe
Hmm. Sure. Hmm.
and that time. Um, and I don't know that we worked very far beyond that, but what I
Yeah.
saw when I was working with aging and dying and in the hospice work I did after my mother's death is that there was a lot going on in bodies. It was extremely somatic and interesting. And so we are really bridging all of that work and looking at life as a flow. And it is hugely transformational for people. Who knew?
I love it. And I think we have this almost, I'm going to step back and get some definitions for listeners, but we have this almost myopic focus on early life. Like there's trauma happens in the first 7 years, and then everything else is kind of like a consequence of that. And I think there's a lot more focus now on pre and perinatal stuff
Yes,
happening.
yes, yes.
But I love this kind of how is death and dying a part of vitality? Like what is that link?
I think that what we have to do is back up just a little bit and look at our
Mm,
definitions, our implicit definitions of life and what's
mm,
been given to us.
mm,
When I started looking at this problem, going, what I saw that there was a lot of vitality in death. In other words, in a room in which somebody was dying, there could be a lot of trauma and distress, but there also could be this expansive, incredible energy and
mm,
incredible things were happening in relationships and in the just the energy around people, and there was a huge transformation going on that was profound and important
mm,
and impacted the body, of course.
mm,
People,
mm,
especially the Tibetans, who really watched death in the body,
mm,
knew a lot about the signs of death, and so I started with that. Um, so you asked about vitality. I think that I started looking at where the heck did we get started with the idea that the ultimate life vital moment was something around 27, 28 years old, where we're, you know, playing tennis and tan and, having a lot of lovers or something. I mean,
mm,
we carry that in our culture. We don't even know we
mm,
carry it. And what I started digging, I started really seeing that it was in our definitions of life, even in biology,
mm,
that life is to be not death. We have defined life as an antithesis to death. It isn't. Death,
mm,
life holds both birth and death, and we see this in our breathing, we see this in our waking and sleeping, we see this everywhere in our lives and our openings and closings. That our life is something that's holding all of these things.
mm,
But in our scientific definitions, we had totally cut this off as if we could somehow stay on this side, and not go to that side.
mhm,
So our definitions of life actually are, if I can remember, the five things in biology. We say death is the what isn't a life, what is life isn't death, and it has to do with metabolism, reproduction, um, growth,
Respiration.
respiration, etc.
Hmm.
Well, no, respiration isn't on the list actually.
Speak.
Metabolism,
Yeah.
uh, I can't remember the fifth. But if you look at our what it is to age, you see that we're stopping doing all those things, right? I don't reproduce anymore. I'm not growing my body anymore. I'm all of these things, which means I'm dying, right? And that means I'm not living, right? And so of course everybody's in a panic. We don't even know how deeply we carry this idea.
Mm,
So that is the first thing we take off out or look at the school is like that isn't true. It can't be true. Let's look another way. And
mm,
so when you start to look at life as energy and consciousness that's animating the body and changing the body, then we suddenly relax. Okay,
mm,
that's a first sign that we might have something that our body understands as true, is that it's the energy forming us and changing and building us and then leaving. When we start looking at the patterns of that consciousness,
mm,
uh, there's people go through all kinds of shifts, and they're mainly positive ones because we will
mm,
have a lot of fear of dying and aging.
mm. It's
I
interesting.
hope I answered your question.
No, you did. And it feels to me like very much like if we have a relationship with death and dying that is, the end of something, then of course we're going to fight the ending. And then it completely, I don't think people realize that it will change our relationship to the thing that we're trying to perpetuate. I feel like in COVID, we saw this a lot. There was like so much fear of death as if life was a privilege that it was always a given and that death was the thing that we were all trying to avoid. It just, my head was like,
Yeah.
it feels inconsistent.
It's a huge topic what happened at the pandemic and all of our we were exposed to all of our ideas about life and death and illness,
Mm, mm,
and all of the somewhat negative things that are connected to it, how
yeah.
our fear of death operates in our social and political and medical worlds,
Right.
to create a lot of insanity, really. Um, so I think if you're going back to the question, what does the school do? We're trying to look at all of that. We're trying to
Mm,
look
mm-hmm,
the terror that is behind us
mm,
implicitly in our psyches around death that we never talk about,
mm,
and but also relax into a broader perspective on what life is. Life is not just a body. Life is
mm,
not just defined by materiality.
mm,
So,
mm.
and
It's
that's
yeah, it feels, I can feel it inside my system as you're talking. It's like, it's these givens that we never stop to question. And all parts of our education are about this. I'm medically trained, which is all about preservation of things for as long as
right,
possible.
right, right, right. The
That's the whole
thingness of
point.
us.
Yeah, the thinginess.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the the decline is how it's said, the decline of aging. Like, I live
Yes.
in a health optimization world, which is essentially trying to improve health span. And
Right.
I'm like, people who are saying to me, oh yeah, I want to live till I'm 180, and they're going around injecting young plasma into their bodies and all that jazz. And I'm like, it feels instinctively somewhere not good to me.
Yeah.
But like
Yeah.
this, yeah, I
It's
mean,
full of fear. It is
yeah,
full of fear.
yeah,
And I think that that is not ultimately fear, of course, is not very conducive to vitality or
vitality. Yeah,
clutching on to a particular way of being. Like
yeah,
mostly when people want to be young, they want to be 27, 28, or maybe 30, I
right.
mean, there's a certain, uh, kind of development, adult development they want to hang on to. But of course,
Mm-hmm,
hanging on to a state of being is not vital. It is frozen and it will never bring vitality.
mm-hmm,
So much more interesting to me, at least, and of course, this is what we do, is to show people the transformational possibilities of aging and
mm,
how, as we work, of course, we work with the kind of a U, what we call the U, the bathtub.
mm,
We develop a body, and then slowly, 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 our energy starts to reverse and rise.
mm,
This is not a trauma or tragedy. This is the way life works.
mm,
Life is a pulsation, including through our bodies.
mm,
So as the energy rises and we start, in a way, digesting our early experiences, we gain a great deal even as our body is changing. So I often say, does does aging need to cost something? Does wisdom need to cost something? Do we need to
Mm,
give something up? We give up some parts of our energetic system, and our body starts to show that.
mm,
But we're also expanding on other levels. And when
mm,
we start to introduce, oh, yeah, but all of this is coming in. How thrilling, we see elders start to become really alive in ways
mm.
that our communities really need elders to be alive to
Right.
sustain
It's
the larger.
interesting. I mean, the fact you mentioned elders in the community is interesting. I live in Austin, Texas, and we have a very young community. We are a community center, and we have a very young community, and yet my mum's just been visiting for 3 months. We've just employed one of our people's mums, one of our employees' mums, to be mama bear for the organization. It's like we really are trying to nurture the elder in the psyche of the younger, actually, in the people, actually getting people to respect's the wrong word, to appreciate the wisdom and the gravitas that comes with increasing age.
Well, there's a kind of feeding we get from it. The
Mm,
young get from the old. There's a
mm,
kind of feeding the old get from the young. When we all stay in our bands of, oh, that's a retirement community, or oh, this is a, community of young parents, we don't get to feed each other.
mm,
And it also increases our fear. If we never
mm,
see an elder, or we never talk to them about their issues, or see them laugh, or see what they do and how they somehow are vital and have joy,
mm,
we will fear aging.
mm, mhm.
So, I think that uh, empowering elders is one of the fun things I get to do, and I am one. So as I am growing in my age, I'm 62 now, I'm saying, "Wow, this is awesome." Like, I'm really enjoying my life now, and many people
Mm,
in their 60s and 70s say that.
mhm. So we were mentioning just before we press record, like how well is this received by the field? What is the kind of, because this to me, when you speak, I'm like, this makes total sense. So does the field receive this kind of let's put death and dying on the table kind of thought process?
You mean the field of body psychotherapy?
Yeah. Hmm.
Oh, well, I would say there's a curiosity generally. I think it's generally known that we haven't discussed this in our theories. Um, People are out trying to advance their theories and their ideas, of course.
Mm,
But my overall sense is it's just kind of exactly what happens in the larger population, which is I'll think about that later. I'll think about that later. Yeah, yeah, that's important, but this is more important.
mm,
And so I don't think it has hit the ground in terms of the power that can be present when you fully incorporate it in your theories and sit down and do the work and listen. It's sort of like doing your will, right? I mean, who really wants to do it? Who
yeah.
wants to stop and think about your healthcare proxy or anything else? But there's something that you gain when you do it. And death and dying is just the same. I think that the people that are looking for it are mainly under about 40 years old or 35
Oh, that's
and
interesting.
missing,
So
not the old.
young people are like looking towards this, but that's interesting. Hmm.
Been my observation. In terms of body psychotherapy,
Sure.
uh, it's yeah, it's the thing we don't talk about there too, and in psychology, you know.
Right.
Just to tell a story about three researchers, which some of your listeners may know of. Terror management theory is getting some attention now. There are three researchers who started it back in the 80s: Tom Pazinski, Sheldon Solomon, and Jeff Greenfield, I think.
Hmm.
They started looking at Ernst Becker's work, Denial of Death, and how denial of death works in our psyches, and how
Hmm.
it's related to some of the kind of unsavory things we see in our political world, in our hatred of other groups, in our projection. And they wanted to talk about it and test it. And
Hmm.
by gosh, they did not get a very warm reception in the APA conferences and couldn't
Hmm.
get published. And so this has been going on for a very long time. The denial is so deep that even in a body centered psychotherapy, we aren't really turning toward it.
Hmm.
And I can't get a lot of people to engage with me, but I get the students I do. And I'm happy to have people want to engage the conversation. I
Right.
Yeah.
It's so fascinating because it feels like it's one of those situations where a byproduct of the fear that we are talking about is the avoidance of talking about the thing that
Yeah,
would
yeah.
actually help overcome the fear. It's one of
Yeah,
those
yeah,
catch
yeah.
22
Exactly,
situations.
exactly, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
experience. There's another factor here, if I can name it.
Mm,
Uh, I don't know how to say this, I don't want to offend anyone, but we have to acknowledge that most of our theories came from men, and men have a somewhat different perspective on life processes than women do.
yeah.
And I know, at least in Reichian processes, with Reich so focused on sexuality
Yeah.
as the panacea, and the downward movement of energy, which I think is a bit more male in general.
Right.
Uh, that the ideas of birth, well, maybe birth from the baby's point of view, but not birth from the mother's point of view, the
Mm,
transformation of parenting, the all of these things that women traditionally held
mm-hmm,
really have not been dealt with as
mm,
important.
mm-hmm,
Okay, so birth and death are women's traditional, they are the ones that have watched those processes, watched what happens, aided them, aided the sick. And so there are many insights that are missing from our theory as a result of having come from male physicians, frankly, from Europe. So there have been many innovators too and women that have participated. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying this is a missing piece in part because of the traditional divide of genders in
mm.
profession.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I see that in all of the ways things are taught, as well as like talked about from these theories perspectives. I also see, I was saying this again during our kind of chat the other day about this medical whole human care thing. It's all very ableist as well. There's a very able-bodied kind of approach
Yeah,
to
yeah, yeah,
all of this work. And I'm like, how are we in the somatic field? How are we in bodies? And we are totally approaching it from an ableist functional physiology when we have people who don't have that. And
yeah.
does the whole model break down? Because if it does, it's not a great model. It needs to be different.
It's a beautiful question. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and I think that, admitting, processes of, what you call decline, I wouldn't call it decline,
Mm,
I would call it ascent or transformation, but decline of the body, illness will
mm,
happen to everybody. It is a huge psychophysiological process.
mm,
It is
mhm,
a huge journey, and not to have that in our theories, or not to have limitation and transformation around the body as part of it is a real limitation. That's all I will say.
mhm,
I won't blame people for it. I'm just saying you are correct. We are reflecting this very youth focused, sexuality focused, even birth focused idea of what it is to be fully human or fully alive.
mm,
And it is much more complicated than that.
mm, mhm. Yeah.
Mm.
Talk to us a little bit more about this Reichian view of downward energy and what you're talking about, upward energy, because I think our listeners will get it conceptually, but I'd love you to just flesh that out a little bit in terms of the
Yeah.
differences and what you're really speaking to in that energy movement.
Well, I think that Reich knew that energy moved down the body. He talked about working from the eyes down the body. Um, and how I teach this, or what I became aware of, was that, of course, as a mother, you see that your children are born almost all head, and they grow their bodies from their head. I mean, it's like a downward movement of growth
Yeah.
too. It's called the allometric wave, and
Hmm.
so we can see that our growth proceeds from the head down. And I think
Mm,
Wright knew that energy moved from the head down. He felt that energy pooled in the genitals as adults and had to be discharged through sex for, to be healthy.
hmm.
Lowen took that further into grounding down into the legs and into the earth,
Mm,
but you feel that downward, like we grow up,
mm,
we grow our bodies, we grow our legs, we grow our feet, you know, that time when our kids are about 13, 14 years old where their feet just grow, and it's like that movement of development is in the body. But then there is the question of, okay, then what? And I think Lowen's idea was, well, you just hang out there as long as you can, you just life just runs out,
right.
that's what happens. And Reich
Hmm.
never addressed it at all. You just
Mm,
have more sex. I don't know. I don't know what Reich thought, honestly. I have I'm not a Reichian. But what I have observed is that slowly, 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 that energy starts to rise. And the way I learned that was by watching how people died in the nursing home, and you could see the
Mm.
transformation much more obviously, became really apparent. But I
Mm-hmm.
believe it starts to happen around, right after we fully develop, we start to
Mm.
change direction, just like
Mm.
flowers do. They
Mm-hmm.
bloom and then they slowly contract.
Mm-hmm.
So we are doing the same thing. I make that visible for people. I help them see that they're part of nature, which we haven't brought up yet.
Mm.
And we also haven't discussed nature in body psychotherapy, as if, people have bodies, but we aren't similar at all to the tree outside my window.
You mean we don't exist in a vacuum and we aren't like just super special things over here that are not connected to the natural world?
Correct.
Well, no, it's very true. Like there is I get it. Like science has to separate to be able to explore, to investigate, to understand. But I think it requires the practitioners and the people who are in the field to bring it all back together. So please take the floor and speak about nature. Talk to us about how you see that connection and that link to humanness.
Oh, wow. Well, the way that I do it in the school is I show how life moves.
Mm.
And once we start understanding life as movement and as energy, and see that there's something shaping, forming, and transforming our bodies as our consciousness is changing,
Mm.
and it reverses and does something very, that we're in a pulsation.
Mm-hmm.
And guess we start by looking at our friend teachers, the plants, like the one behind me, because
Mm-hmm.
they move so quickly and they don't actually change location. So you can set a camera on them for a time lapse and you can watch their
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
movement forms. Daniel Stern talked about movement forms
Mm-hmm.
as our first language as infants.
Mm.
We are watching patterns of gestures of life movement, really,
Yeah.
in our mother's voice, in her toward and away.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we can watch plants doing this formation like
Mm.
this, and we start to say, oh, wow, that tree out there is in a process that's moving.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Oh my gosh, I'm doing it too. Oh, wow, it's not about me hanging on. I am in a big wave of rhythmic connection with the rest of the world.
Mm.
I am in a conversation with nature
Mm-hmm.
that I am a part of, not separate from.
Mm.
It's not
Mm-hmm.
my job to control it. It's not, now something else opens up and we start breathing and differently, honestly,
Mm-hmm.
when we have this
Mm.
idea. So I make that very explicit, that
Mm.
connection. We have to allow the energy to reverse in order to experience that
Mm.
deeper
Mm.
naturalness within our bodies.
Mm-hmm.
So
It must make it also easier because I think we understand death as a part of life when we think of the natural world a little bit more than we do with
absolutely
ourselves. So
correct.
it must be easier for people to log into a little bit. It's like, oh, the tree, the plant, we accept the cycles. So even if it's a tree that loses its leaves every year, we kind of get that death is part of the natural life cycle. So that must assist humans with it landing in our nervous system that this is our process
Absolutely.
as well.
I think the separation from nature and our fear of death are hand in glove. That we have
Mm,
separated ourselves from nature in part because of our fear of being a part of that rhythmic nature. Or, I mean, this is right brain consciousness, really, that we're talking about, that we can
mm,
re-enliven by learning this again. We have to
mm,
re-enliven it. It used to be, I think, much more available to us
right.
than in the last several hundred years.
Mm,
So we have successfully removed ourselves from nature. We have removed death from life as
mm,
the opposite of life.
mm,
And and that process, we have moved more and more to the abstract, fragmented part of the left brain and chopped everything up from each other. And yet we're hurting because we're so disconnected.
mm,
So to re-enliven more of this infant capacity for seeing gesture and seeing movement and seeing our own
mm,
relationship in a context is
mm.
huge. I call it a slow drip psychedelic.
Yeah,
So,
I
yeah,
love that. Yes, and people are talking about
yeah,
plant medicines as the plant medicines that you take, and sometimes stop and think, but plants are medicine anyway. You don't need to chop them up and make a brew and drink them. Like just the relationship with the natural world is
I agree.
medicine.
Yeah, that's true. This is a possibility.
Mm.
Um, so I do want to make a point,
Mm.
because I talk about death in school. People often think it's a school about death. It is not. This is what the human psyche does. Once you say the D word, people latch onto the D word, and then it's all about death. No, it is a school about vitality and life force and somatics, but it is one that includes that. And so
Mm.
this goes in all directions. It's also not just about the human life cycle of an individual, because obviously we're in relationships all the time. And
Mhm.
what you see is if you exclude this dying idea or this ramping down idea
Mhm.
from everything, your relationships don't work that well either and become kind of brittle. So we are about relationship pulsation, how you dance with another person and how you stay in connection but don't grip or cut. We are about communities and how they form and what their organic rhythmic characteristics are.
Mm. It's interesting. And I'm really pleased that you made that point because I've done exactly what people do. I'm like, death is the novel thing here. Let's talk about the death thing. And like, you explicitly
Well,
said this is part of it. And it's including it as a study of all of the other life principles, which is, of course, relating. It's all of the things that happen within the human life, which includes death, which I like. I
yeah, yeah.
thank you for the reframe.
And
Yeah.
I think traditional cultures taught this. This was called initiation. That they made sure that you understood what the cyclical processes were, and that you had the maturity to understand that you were immortal and you were temporarily in a body, but you were more than the body. And so,
Mm.
in a certain way, that happens too. Yeah,
Hmm. And it's lovely to think of like just allowing death to be on the table allows for more life. Is kind of what I'm hearing you say.
absolutely, absolutely. So this is a false project really to try to live forever or all of that. I mean, you might get to, but what are you going to have to pay for that?
I can give you actual monetary sums and also
I know,
emotional
I know,
costs.
I know. And what we will do ecologically and to the children of this planet if we do
That
that. So
was where I was going. That was going to be my next question because it feels to me like the very concept of the biohacking longevity is disrespectful to nature. It's disrespectful to the natural laws of ebb and flow, living and dying, and the cycles. And it kind of feels like that is going hand in hand with the disrespect that we're currently demonstrating to our planet and the sustainability, the using up of resources. I'd love you to speak on any of that if that's something that
well,
interests you.
absolutely. And this is a very sophisticated point. I don't know if I can bring it across. I will try.
Mm.
I do think, I'm teaching my classes right now, going to the second year, about pulsation and how at some point we have to decide, our wave is coming along, we're with nature, we're pulsing with nature. At some point we have to change direction if we want to uh, stay alive.
Mm.
But if you push, 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 at what point is it? And let's see how big we can make this thing. Let's see how long we can live. Let's see how take it to it breaks. I've heard this before. We want to be exponential instead of in a waveform. And so that striving not to surrender, we could say,
Mm.
has to source energy from someplace.
Hmm.
In other words, the natural return, the natural world causes sinusoidal processes to happen as part of what we're part of
Mm.
biologically.
Mm.
Exponentially, when we try to make things exponential, that they never turn, they never have the humility to fail a little bit. They never have the humility to say, "Okay, I'm going to give up trying to, put cream on my face. Ah, whatever. Um, I'm gonna I'm going to work with this process."
Mm.
Um, I think that when we fight against natural processes, we have to pull energy in from somewhere. We either are making slaves of somebody or we're pulling in things from the environment. Do you see what I'm saying?
I
We
do.
start
Hmm.
to denature the world. We try
Mm.
start to build up and build up our castles that are never going to give in. But there is another part of that story of something else that's had to pay for that.
Mm.
You see, whether science and technology now is just focusing all of its money and attention on longevity. I'm sure they'll learn some interesting things. I'm not,
Hmm.
you know, against that. But what about the children? What about healthcare? What about ordinary healthcare? Will we go,
Mm.
you know, do we really need that? Or could we learn to open our hearts and have a more humble attitude about being human? Or do we need to make, icons of ourselves that last forever? I think this is an open question, but personally, I know what side
I
I'm
know.
on.
I was going to say, I don't think you think it's an open question. I think you're just putting it out there as an open question. And it's fascinating because I live in this world and I see a lot of value to the health span medicine. So
Mhm.
how do we not trash our bodies with all of the crap that isn't really natural to ensure that we retain the vitality that we are innately built with? But for me, when I look at that, it's basically, it is a return to nature. It's like eliminate the toxic rubbish that has nothing to do with humanness. It's chemicals, it's artificial, all that kind of stuff. And I do see benefit to that. But sometimes I'm looking at all of the things that you could do from a longevity medicine perspective, and all of the, what is it really trying to achieve? And I think there are some people who would say they're trying to just achieve the octogenarian Olympics, which is simple stuff. It's just being able to pick up your grandkids when you're 80, which I think somewhere in that there's a, yeah, that's
Yeah,
a
yeah,
vitality
yes,
pursuit.
I get it, and I think that everybody's gonna have to walk this path that is in the privileged West that has money. I mean, we'll have to make a choice about that. How
Right.
far do we go? What are our priorities? And I would just like to say that my focus is on the life force itself.
Mm,
And so, I have this expression, the life force doesn't really care if it's in a body or not. It wants to be healthy.
mhm,
So if it can't be healthy in a body, it'll leave a body.
mm,
That's called illness. And I'm not trying to oversimplify anything, but I
mm,
am saying that how what we do has to be understood by our deepest self as
mm,
vitality, not just, oh, I want to do this. My ego wants to do that. Sometimes we have to have the humility to be disabled. Sometimes we need to depend on other people. That's part of our growth
mm.
in giving up a little bit and learning. And so it's not always so clear that functioning is the answer to everything.
I love that you made that point. And I think when you look at the kind of spiritual, the wisest people who are filled with life force, sometimes they are in really disabled bodies. You know, you think of Ram Dass towards the end, and you're just like, huh, it
Great
didn't,
teacher, you know?
right. And the essence, I was saying this again to someone the other day, like I felt a lot more connected to my soul and my center when I was actually unwell. Like I was unwell for a very long time. And it wasn't it was because I wasn't distracted by bells and whistles and lights and work and stress. I was very connected to the presence or the absence of the life force and how to get it back.
Yeah,
And that
exactly.
wasn't a complicated
Right.
medical solution as much as it was a
Yeah.
reconnection to source or soul or center.
And perhaps what you were doing here and what you still had to do.
Very much so.
So I'm always amazed how the body responds when we are really aligned with, I need to do this thing and I came here to do it and I'm going to do it and I am going to clear out all the things that I put in the way of doing what I came here to do. I don't know the degree to which everybody has that, but I think we're all here in form for something. And when we get ill, we become really clear about that.
Mm,
And and we have to, or we have an opportunity to reclaim it
mm,
most of the time and
mm,
take a step of some kind. So yes, I mean the physical stuff I'm sure is hand in glove and can help and is, but it's not the whole story. Part of the story is um, life purpose and the our alignment with it.
mhm,
So
mm.
um, yeah,
And we talk a lot here about meaning making, you know, making a meaning of the thing, for good and for bad. So, you
Mm,
know, fictionalizing narratives, but also the meaning behind the storyline of what your body is trying to say with its symptoms or illness to move you towards the trajectory of greater destiny. And that feels
yes,
to me like a
yes,
powerful way to
yes,
view any of this.
right,
Mm,
right. I agree with that. Um, So yeah, we're doing the simplest thing really, which is just trying to help people understand that they're in a life arc of changing energy. That if they never get a sick a day in their life, they're going to be regulated by this movement.
Mm,
Everybody does it. I call it the deep intrinsic regulation within the human body
mhm,
that will take you through a growth process and will take you through an aging process. And that's hard enough for people to get their head around before we even but it starts to be get, more and more advanced skills when you deal with illness or death
right.
of a child or disruptions or trauma. But I do believe it's kind of a base level understanding that we can source to
Mm,
put it in somatic experiencing terms, we can resource
right. Mhm.
that deep river of that deep current within us that knows where it's going.
Such an interesting way to put it because we talk, for those listeners who don't know, in somatic experiencing, you do talk about being resourced, having the resources to regulate, to find center, to whatever the thing is.
Mhm.
It's not taught in somatic experiencing that connection to that life force energy is a resource. And I feel
Yeah.
like a lot of this trauma training instinctively says that you are separate from the life force. It's like some fracture happened and we need to fix the fracture without returning to the life force, which doesn't seem like it's actually going to work.
Mhm. Yeah, interesting. Well, this is one of the places where I think what I'm doing in SoULL or we're doing in SoULL is a bridge and a connection between the Neo-Reichian work of last century and the somatic experiencing and the trauma and mindfulness folks who
Mm,
are in different camps entirely, pretty much.
mm,
But for me, this developmental work that was
mhm,
started with the Reichians is a very deep movement of the life force itself that we can start to understand and use as a resource.
mm,
For example, I'm sure if you work with people
mhm,
as a therapist, which I do, you've had people that have had so much trauma from very early on, from poor parenting or separations or etc. And yet, there's hardly a place to stand before the trauma began.
mm,
And yet, with a perspective of yourself as a being that existed before all that and will exist
mm,
after, and the movement that we can become aware of what brought us through stage after stage and event after event. There was a river we were standing on that
mhm,
brought us here that is remarkable. Do you
mm,
understand? So there are times where you just must resource this deep existential self
mhm,
to heal.
mm.
And I think this model does help that along a little bit.
I think it's so fascinating because when I speak to people about my healing journey, and my listeners will know I had a very complex illness. I was very close to death for a long time in my life.
Yeah.
And it's like when people say to me, how did you get through it? How did you get through? I do speak to this surrendering connection to something that was way deeper than kind of me, but had me as a thread line in it, and really trusting the universe, as I would call it then, and probably still would name it now. That this was an incarnation in a physiology, and if the physiology wasn't able to cope with the life force that it incarnated, then I would go. And I didn't really have any problems with that. Everybody else had problems with it when I said it. But because I was this very unwell 22-year-old, like saying, I'm really
Oh,
okay with death.
wow.
And
Yeah.
so, like, people freaked out. People were like, is she suicidal? Is she? And I was like, I just had this felt sense connection to the it's weird to describe. It's like the permanence of life force, but also the impermanence of physiology. And I kind of just got it
Yes,
somewhere.
yes, exactly. Yes, beautiful. Wow. And so that's an initiation. You were initiated.
Mm,
And I think it's those kinds of awarenesses that people that have had near death experiences teach us a lot. They go through huge transformations and they are open to a much bigger picture that I believe we need to start bringing into body psychotherapy more clearly and
mm.
theoretically. And so I'm glad you're here doing what you're doing so
Thank
beautifully.
you.
Well.
Thank you. I mean, to me, when you speak and when we're talking about this, it feels like that this is some of what people are trying to get with the psychedelic experiences that are
Yeah,
now
absolutely.
everywhere. It's
Absolutely.
like
Yeah.
this essence of putting your own life force in the picture of the bigger picture, understanding the impermanence, but the magnitude at the same. It feels like this is what everyone tells me, but I've not done psychedelic journeys, but it feels like everyone's telling me something that I already know to be true.
You did it. You did it the
The
old-fashioned
hard
way.
way. Yeah. Well, and I say this to people, and of course, there's this kind of like ego glow of those who've done psychedelics. And it's very much like you do it and you tell me if that's true. And I'm like, okay, but like you can't tell me what I went through because you've not done it. So,
It's its own psychedelic. Well, I don't know about that, but what I do think, I think that you're right that people are trying to do this, and it's great research being done on the psyche and what can be done. I have been in contact with the people, and I know the people in NYU and John Hopkins doing the psilocybin
mm,
research and so on.
yeah,
And I think it's profound and important.
mm,
And I would like to say with better life and death education, we may not need to do it that way. I mean, I think
yeah,
we do need to wake people up now because we are
because
so
we're so
off
in
in the
there.
weeds, right? But anyway, we do it. But then after the experience, you're still left in a world in which you still have to make sense of.
Yeah,
And so that's why I call SoULL a slow drug psychedelic, because we really do accompany you on a much longer journey and of
yeah.
integration of those understandings into life.
Hmm.
So, no judgment of it. It's just I think that more might be needed.
Right.
Oh,
Well, and that's what struck me as you were talking about soul. There's this element of like this is doing the the actual boots on the ground work through some of this stuff rather than just these one-off experiential things which leave you then back in the old paradigm potentially without the
well,
integration.
right. I mean, it might take us into that right brain experience, let's just say, let's call it that. But our left brain still needs some ideas to
Right.
start to work with that, you see. So what I find is that we go from the guru and the experience to and the science has the same thing, but they're running in different tracks. They're not
Hmm.
integrated.
Mm.
But when I think we really feel good and are intuitive and we have both of those sides of our brain working somehow in better harmony with each other. And
Mm.
I think that's what we're working for,
Hmm. Mm.
as well as the upper body and the lower body.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So what kind of people are attracted to come and study with you? What are you noticing as trends?
Well, definitely young healers. We call our certification whole life doulas, actually. I'm not certifying people as I didn't want to get involved with psychological associations or anything like that. I just wanted to say this is a normal thing to do. These teachings are normal and ordinary. And also this tradition of women having held this doula wisdom
Sure.
of companioning people. So we are
Mm.
calling it that. So there are people that want to be trained as some kind of helper. It is a 400-hour somatic training. So there's that. I would say most people, though, come in because they're freaked out about aging, dying, or grief for some reason, or
Mm.
they're a social worker
Hmm.
who's looking at their own mortality or some kind of a helper. Surprisingly, we've had a lot of medical people in the work, and especially people that are kind of rather burned out or disillusioned with the medical system, and it has been pretty hugely helpful to them.
Mm.
So I think that's been a surprise. Haven't had so many somatic therapists, a few, unfortunately. So it's mainly people that are being pulled in by their own existential issues or
Mm.
wanting to. Mhm.
And that's interesting because I mean, it feels like it would be a really nice compliment to somebody who's somatic trained already. But I
Yeah,
suspect there's this kind of
yeah,
sense that they kind of have done the somatic training and therefore
they got it.
what's
Yeah,
what
and
else do they need? But
but even I would like to say to any of your listeners who might be
mm,
have a half an ear open to maybe doing soul, for example. I'm
mm,
not marketing it really, but to do the first weekend alone, we design it so you can just take that first 4-day
that's
training,
nice.
add something to we'll add something to your work that will feed your work. I mean, you don't have to do a whole 3-year thing. It's just the first weekend alone or the first year is very nutritious. Let's
Mm.
put it that way.
That's really lovely, and I'll make sure I put all of the links to do that first weekend or the first year or the whole course in the show notes so that people can access it. Because I sense that people will be interested. We get a lot of interested people listening to our podcast who really are fascinated about broadening their skill set. A lot of what we talk about is whole human stuff, which means that having this perspective that is slightly broader will be incredibly helpful.
Okay,
Mm.
good. Good.
So, as we draw to a close, is there anything else you would like to talk about today? We focus it very much on your work. Is there anything else that you would like to speak to? Anything that you would like to make my listeners aware of or would like to point out?
Wow, we've covered a lot. I think the only thing I will reiterate, which I did mention, is that to start to look this way takes us in all kinds of directions,
Mm,
surprising directions. We start to look at relationships differently. We start to look at grief differently. We have theories of grief now about the energy of how the body can, how losing somebody we're very attached to affects the body of the person who survives.
mhm,
I don't believe we've gone into that either in somatic work. And it's not just about working with people in grief. It's about seeing these larger attachment and differentiation processes as part of our
mm,
nature and
mhm,
part of what that we can have good, differentiations for people, that we can
mm,
recognize that we need to allow more differentiation.
mm,
It also goes so deeply. Dying well, as Stephen Jenkins says. Well, let me quote Stephen better. A good death is a village making event, and a bad death
mm,
is a village destroying event. I'm probably misquoting him a little, but Stephen Jenkinson of Grief Walker. Stephen's right about that. The way
mm,
we do death and dying, the way we do grieving in our culture
mm,
matters to everything.
mhm,
And the fact that we don't turn toward death is not it's not a coincidence that we have so much fragmentation and disconnection in our culture, because we don't
mm,
allow death and its processes to feed us and connect us.
mm.
So that is, I would like to just say it's relatively vast, but don't be afraid.
I think that's the theme though. I think it's like we are afraid. Like
Yeah,
anyone who's not looking at it is afraid. So
yeah.
stepping into really embracing death as part of natural reality in life, or seeing life as part of death, or whichever way you want to phrase it, it feels like I feel calmer in my nervous system after
Yes,
having this
exactly.
conversation with you today.
This is the confirmation. And
Mm,
as a death educator, I saw it over and over and over again, that
mm,
how you know that death is that we are leaving this out of, and we have a somatic response to pushing death away, is that when we start to learn about it, people settle, they
mm,
connect, they are relieved, they feel better in their bodies.
mm,
So this is part of the confirmation. And I thank you very much, Victoria, for pulling me out and getting me to
mm.
talk and
Of
share,
course.
you know.
Yeah, no, and I really hope that all my listeners are kind of feeling the same thing too, and are having their own version of that confirmation. And I suspect they will be. And so if that's you, head to the show notes and we will ensure that we've put all of the links. I've got a load of references and resources, and you've mentioned books and things. So I'm going to make sure we put as much as possible of all the resources you've mentioned in the show notes for my listeners. Thank you so much for spending the time with me today and for doing the work that you do. I feel it feels important to me, and I feel like I'm really honored to grab a little piece of your time to share with my listeners.
Great. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Wasn't that an interesting and really, really relevant viewpoint on healing and actually what it means to be alive as a human being? I hope that you found that as fascinating as I did when I interviewed Jeanne, and I really hope that you check out all of the show notes, because we will put links to all of the resources mentioned there. There is a training beginning just a few weeks from when this podcast is released, and if you have any interest in that, again, the links that you need will be in today's episode show notes. And go and find Jeanne on the interwebs and give her a bit of love. There is a lot of resources out there that she's created. Her book, head to the show notes and you can read everything that you need and find all of the resources available. And I will see you next week on the Unveil podcast.